All right, hello and welcome. Today we're going to climb a pretty fascinating ladder of knowledge, one that was built over 1400 years ago. We're diving into an incredible text by an early Christian thinker, Maximus the Confessor, to really understand this ancient and, frankly, profound path to knowing God.
So we've all heard that phrase, right? Take up your cross. And usually we think it just means, enduring some hardship. But what if it's more than that? What if it's actually a key, a technical instruction for a deep philosophical journey? Well, the text we're looking at suggests it's the very first step on a ladder to a whole new state of being. So here's the path we're going to take. First, we'll redefine the cross as a kind of philosophical practice. Then, we'll get into this wild idea of how the divine reaches down to us. After that, we'll tackle the huge paradox of how you can know something that's unknowable. And finally, we'll see how it all comes together at the summit, what it means to actually participate in the divine. Okay, so let's start at the foundation, right at the beginning. How does a physical object, the cross, become the starting point, the launch pad, for this incredible mental and spiritual ascent? Our whole exploration kicks off right here. In this specific passage from Maximus the Confessor, he makes this argument that the instruction to take up your cross isn't about passively suffering through life. No, it's about actively embracing a life of what he calls ascetic practice. So, what in the world does he mean by that? For Maximus, this idea of ascetic practice isn't about self-punishment. Not at all. It's more like a form of training. The goal is to mortify the passions, things like anger, greed, pride, but you're not trying to destroy them. The idea is to just quiet them down so the mind can finally get clear enough to see what's actually real. It's almost like cleaning a really dirty window to finally see the view outside. And Maximus lays out this super clear step-by-step process. It starts with that physical discipline, the ascetic practice, which helps you get to a state of inner calm. He calls this dispassionate practice. From that stable ground, you can then begin cognitive contemplation of the world. And that ultimately leads you to theology, which for him means direct insight into the divine. It's literally a ladder, moving you from the body to the mind and finally to the spirit. But here's the thing. This isn't just a one-way street of us doing all the work. Maximus argues that as we're climbing this ladder, the divine is also reaching down to meet us. Let's dig into how he describes this divine movement. And this leads us to this really strange and kind of wonderful phrase from the text. It says, the logos becomes thick. I mean, what on earth could that mean? It sounds almost physical, doesn't it? Thankfully, the text doesn't just leave us hanging with that mysterious phrase. It actually explains that this thickening of the divine happens in two distinct but totally related ways that help us make sense of it. First, the logos becomes thick in the flesh. And for Christian theology, that's the incarnation, the divine becoming a human being. But it also becomes thick in ideas, in parables and stories, and even in the way the natural world is structured. All of these act as symbols that point to a much deeper reality. And just so we're all on the same page, when the text says logos, it's pulling from this really rich concept from both Greek philosophy and Christian thought. A good way to think of it is as the underlying intelligence, maybe like the operating system of the universe that gives everything its structure and meaning. So, the crucial question is, why does this thickening even happen? Well, the text says it's an act of condescension. The divine simplifies itself. It makes itself accessible in forms we can actually understand, like flesh and ideas, so that it can meet us on our level and then guide us back up to its simple and unconditioned nature. Okay, so we're climbing, and God is reaching down. But this leads us to a massive intellectual problem. I mean, how do you get to know something that is, by its very nature, completely beyond knowing? And the text faces this paradox head on. It completely acknowledges that the divine essence, what God is in God's own self, is totally inaccessible to our created minds. So, if we can't know what God is, how do we know anything at all? The answer is this really brilliant two-pronged approach. On one hand, we have affirmations. We can look at the world and say positive things. God exists, or the universe seems to be wisely governed. These are things we can know from creation. But on the other hand, we have negations. We also have to say what God is not created, not limited by space, not a physical body. Now, you might be thinking those two paths, saying what God is and what God isn't, are a total contradiction. But the source argues they actually reciprocally complement each other. The affirmations tell us that God is, while the negations constantly remind us that we don't know what God is. Together, they create a kind of intellectual boundary, almost like a silhouette of the divine. And this brings us to the final stage, the very summit of our climb. This is where all these ideas, the practice, the contemplation, the affirmation, and the negation all come together. Maximus synthesizes this whole journey into 3 modes of philosophy. Practical is our aesthetic discipline, how we act. Natural is our contemplation of the created world. And theological is our direct understanding of God. But the key is that for Maximus, these aren't separate subjects you study. They all form one single unified reality. And this is the ultimate takeaway. The entire ladder we've been climbing, it's not just some intellectual exercise to collect facts about God. The goal is experiential. It's to move beyond just knowing and into a state of being, into a state of union or participation with the divine. The journey really culminates in this idea. By gathering up all of our knowledge, the practical, the natural, and the theological, we're brought into the very presence of the Logos itself, the source of all meaning. And there, we're enabled not just to think about it, but to actually experience and see Him. So in the end, this ancient text presents a profound reversal of how we usually think about knowledge. It really challenges us to consider maybe true wisdom isn't found in accumulating more and more information, but in a process of purification and simplification, a journey inward and upward until we reach the silent, simple source of it all,